Can I ask a question? Can I ask a question? What is gravity? What is gravity?
I have no idea. Okay, next question.
Can I ask a question?
What is gravity?
Today we are talking about T. Townsend Brown, the man, the myth, the legend behind the story that has often been hidden in the caverns and in the shadows of history. We're talking about a book today called The Man Who Mastered Gravity. An interesting read, and one that I think you will find very interesting in your research. T. Townsend is not a name that is synonymous with fame, with people that you recognize like Einstein and others. And yet, he may be one of the most famous in people that are in the know, if not infamous in people that are in the know, men that are out there, when it comes to moving history forward. Not only is this book, The Man Who Mastered Gravity, talk about him, but in another very interesting book written by Jonathan Eisen, there is Suppressed Inventions and Other Discoveries. He also mentions him. And this mythic figure, this T. Townsend Brown, crops up in a lot of places that you wouldn't necessarily realize. But when you begin to study, when you begin to research the movers of history, you begin to find this guy's name showing up in some very interesting places, dealing with some very interesting things. And as the title of Paul Schottgen's book states, The Man Who Mastered Gravity, a twisted tale of space, time, and the mysteries in between. Now, the experience of history and the movement and expanse of history is not really moved forward, I believe, on the shoulders of the people that are seen. I'm not saying that the people that are in the news don't play a role in history. I'm just saying the real tectonic shifts in technology, politics, economy, finances, religion, philosophy, the things that really launch mankind forward in its thinking, in its achievement, in generational ways, is often moved on the shoulders of those who are behind the scenes. Behind the lights, behind the cameras, without awards and without accolades, it is the people that no one ever thinks to make a movie about. Those are the people that move history forward. They rarely get a book deal, and you probably never even heard about them. And yet, their discoveries, or their hidden discoveries, or in this case, their buried discoveries, are often the ones that move us forward in a powerful and meaningful way. The silent movers of history are those that are most powerful. And when the sheet of eternity is tallied, we will see, both in the spiritual realm and in the secular realm, that often in the great area in between the unknown and known, it is those people that have worked in the shadows that have moved things forward. Such is the case of T. Townsend Brown, the man who mastered gravity, if indeed you believe gravity is, as you have been led to believe that it is.
Pure fiction.
There is an unusual book, but worth the read, that asks some very powerful questions and answers it with some very powerful answers, and then leaves you with, I think, a lot of very distressing and powerful unknowns. Who is the man, T. Townsend Brown, who claimed to have mastered gravity? Thomas Townsend Brown was born March 18, 1905, and died in 1985. He was an American inventor whose research into odd electrical fields led him to the belief that he had discovered a type of anti-gravity caused by strong electrical fields. Now, let me pause and say that one of the things that interests us here at the Soul Trap is the connectivity. And one thing that's very fascinating in the Bible is that you see this dynamic of electricity, lightning, often playing a role in the spiritual world. For instance, there are beings mentioned in the book of Ezekiel that give the appearance of lightning flashing back and forth. And then, of course, that most famous passage where Jesus himself said that I beheld Satan as lightning being cast from heaven. There's something unusual. There's something autonomous, if I can say it that way, about lightning and the effects of lightning, and then, of course, gravity and the interplay of electromagnetic field and gravitational field. Well, Brown believed that he had found a discovery that led him to a type of anti-gravity caused by strong electric fields. Instead of being an anti-gravity force, what Brown observed has generally been attributed by the mainstream to electrohydrodynamics, the movement of charged particles that transfer their momentum to surrounding neutral particles in the air. It's also called the ionic drift or ionic wind. For most of Brown's life, he attempted to develop devices based on his ideas, trying to promote them for use by the industry of America and globally and the military-industrial complex. The phenomenon came to be called the Bi-Brown effect and electrogravitics. Brown's research influenced some amateur experimenters to build quote-unquote ionic propulsion lifters powered by high voltage. Now, it's very interesting when you connect, again, we're always looking at connections. When you look at the reports of UFOs or UAPs, unidentified aerial phenomenon, you will find that they're very often happening around high electrical dense fields, high voltage fields. So is there a connection there? Some people believe there is. There are still claims that Brown discovered anti-gravity, an idea popular with the UFO community and spawning many conspiracy theories. Now, without going into too much detail and giving away the book, which is worth the read, in 1938, Brown was promoted to lieutenant in the United States Navy. In 1939, he was assigned for a few months as a material engineer for the Navy's flying boats built at the Martin Company in Maryland. He was engaged in magnetic and acoustic minesweeping research development under the Bureau of Ships in Washington, D.C. from 1940 to 1941. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, he transferred to the Atlantic Fleet Radar School in Norfolk, Virginia. Now, it's important to keep in mind he was deeply connected with the Navy, deeply connected with the electromagnetic study, radar, electrical fields, all going on around this time. In 1942, Brown was discharged from Navy service, requesting to be reassigned, quote, for the good of the naval service to escape trial by court-martial. And with his official discharge exam listing no comment, as seen by the reason why. So for some reason, he was quickly pushed out of the Navy's official roster, but there's no particular reason why given. After 1944, Brown worked as a radar consultant to the Lockheed Vega Aircraft Corporation. Now, for those of you that are in the know, wherever there is the Lockheed, eventually Lockheed Martin, wherever there is Lockheed, there are Skunk Works, and wherever there is Skunk Works, there is something strange in the air. No pun intended with the skunk.
It's true.
But after leaving Lockheed, Brown then moved to Hawaii. Now, there's a big jump there, and we're going to come back to that in just a minute. But one of the things you'll read in the book, The Man Who Mastered Gravity, and one of the things that you'll see in research, specifically mentioned in Suppressed Inventions, is that in between this event of leaving the Navy and going to Hawaii on his own study and reconnaissance, there was something called the Philadelphia Project. We'll come back to that in just a moment. After leaving Lockheed, Brown moved to Hawaii, where he was temporarily a consultant to the Pearl Harbor Navy Yard due to Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Pacific Fleet Admiral Radford's interest in Brown's ideas on Gravitar device. And we'll get to what that Gravitar device is in just a moment. However, the work was looked at more as a curiosity, supposedly in the mainstream, rather than any workable device. In 1952, Brown moved to Cleveland, hoping to sell his device, and when you begin to follow him from there, you see that it is one defeat after another as he tried to put forward this new device called the Gravitor. Eventually, Brown became involved in the subject of UFOs, and in 1956, helped found NICAP. Now, for those of you that are familiar, NICAP is the National Investigation Committee on Aerial Phenomenon. Although he was forced out as a director in 1957, with allegations that Brown was using funds to further his anti-gravity research. In 1958, Brown worked as a research and development consultant for the Whitehall Rand Project, an anti-gravity venture at the Bayshon Company in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. That same year, Brown set up an anti-gravity corporation called with Rand International Limited. He filed several patents, but his ideas were met with little success. In the early 1960s, he worked as a physicist for the Electrokinetics Incorporated Board, and then he eventually moved to Pennsylvania, and then eventually moved to California, where Brown died after being in what was called semi-retirement. Now, the legacy there about Brown that we talked about just a moment ago is that concept or that theory of the Philadelphia experiment. In other words, that something took place in that gap in his life when he was out of the Navy and yet still consulting with the Navy. In 1979, author Charles Berlitz and UFOologist William L. Moore published a book called The Philadelphia Experiment, Project Invisibility, which purported to be a factual account about the Philadelphia experiment, where a United States Navy experiment accidentally teleported the warship USS Eldridge. Chapter 10 of the book that they wrote was titled The Force Fields of Townsend Brown, a retelling of Brown's early work, claiming he was involved in the experiment and implying Brown's electrogravitics was the propulsion used by UFO electronics and is also part of other conspiracy theories using this power also to fuel high-powered stealth bombers, some that have not even been revealed to the public as of yet. The UFO and all of these other works, of course, are classified. Brown tried to bring some of this classification into the public light, of course, to make money. He was failed, his character was assassinated, and he was relegated to persona non grata as he ended up dying alone and broke in California. There are also claims that Brown discovered what quote-unquote is called free energy, something that those of you that are familiar with the Tesla concept know that Tesla was talking about free energy long before anybody else was. So this man, T. Townsend Brown, which you have never even heard of, I never even heard of, is a very interesting figure, a shadowy figure. Was he a kook? Maybe. Was he a scientist? Definitely. Was he a brilliant man who discovered something that we don't yet understand? It is highly possible, especially when you get into the concept of what gravity is and what space is. And here is where the book becomes very interesting to those that are in the know and to those that are able to connect the dots between the Bible and the secular world, or I should say, ultimate reality and the reality that you and I perceive. On page 222 and 221, there is an interesting story that begins talking about what are called the Vega Notebooks. Brown was an incessant note-taker. He wrote prolifically, taking notes of different things. And there is an interesting story, an interesting material that the author talks about here regarding the ether, gravity, space, and the continuum in which you and I live, and we think we know, but we know very little of. Paul Shotskin writes in The Man Who Mastered Gravity, he writes on page 222, if the first half of the Vega Notebook describe a device capable of generating, quote, a kick, then the second half addresses the what is being kicked. The second half of the notebook is entitled Structure of Space. It begins with a sidelong glance at one of the most accepted tenets of 20th century science. Now, whenever you hear accepted tenets of 20th century science, what that means is they're telling you what's true, don't question anything. But you have to be careful about that. As we've said before, you have to understand there is a difference between provable science and mathematical science. For instance, you can take a mathematical formula. Picture this in your mind. 1/2 E, 1/2 empty, equals 1/2 full. Well, if you were to multiply both sides of that equation by 2, if you were to take 1/2 empty equals 1/2 full and multiply both, you would eliminate the half, and what you would have is E equals F. empty equals full. It's good math, but it's ludicrous logic. So you have to be careful about what we're talking about. When we're talking about science, are we talking about mathematical constructs, or are we talking about actual hardcore, repeatable, experimentable, tangible results? And so it's talking here about the tenets of 20th century science, which for the most part are built upon mathematical equations. Here is the writing. The failure of the Michelson-Morley experiment to detect a flow of ether does not necessarily indicate the non-existence of the ether. The results of the theory of relativity may be obtained with or without the ether. For certain phenomena, it is desirable and almost necessary to assume the existence of an ether in order to evolve a satisfactory explanation. An example is the force of gravitation, particularly the electrogravitational effects. The phenomenon of the movement of a dielectric is such an example. Now, what are we talking about? Sounds like a lot of big words and complicated ideas. But what we're talking about is that there is not empty space. Between point A and point B, there is not empty space. Prior to the early 20th century, there was believed to be an ether. Some called it a luminous ether. Here, the author goes on. The idea that space is filled with a luminous ether reaches back at least as far as Sir Isaac Newton, who wrote in his 1704 treatise of a medium, an ethereal medium capable of bearing light. We know that because light is a wave, and for there to be a wave, there has to be a medium. Nobody has a wave without water. If light is going to move and act as a wave, and we know that it does scientifically, then it must have a medium. And so there was a belief that between point 1 and 2, A and B, there was not an empty nothingness there, but there was at some subatomic level an ether between the two. That was the medium through which light, both as a wave and particle, were able to move. Just, the author says, as sound waves traveled through the medium of air, the idea of light-bearing medium became one of generally accepted principles of the late 19th century physics. Maxwell proposed a variety of mechanical models. There were problems, though, with Maxwell's models. The ether could be neither solid, liquid, nor gas, but nevertheless it had to be capable of carrying energy, just as air carries sound waves. Now, in 1887, two physicists, Albert Michelson and Edward Morley, and you can read more about that in an amazing book called The Biblical and Observational Case for Geocentricity. But I digress. In 1887, two physicists, Michelson and Morley, thought that they would be able to detect the flow of the ether wind. Between point A and B, they would be able to detect that ether as the Earth orbits the sun. As the Earth, quote-unquote, was moving around the sun, they believed they should be able to detect the movement of the ether. They built an elaborate and expensive apparatus to measure the Earth's movement through the ether by splitting a beam of light at right angles and then observing the phase changes in the beams when they came back together. The results from the first prototype of Michelson's experiment were inconclusive. Seeking greater accuracy, Michelson joined forces with Morley and built a version in the basement of a stone building in Cleveland, Ohio, where it could be isolated from atmospheric effects like heat and vibration. It was mounted on a huge block of marble, which floated on a pool of mercury so that the marble could be easily rotated to measure the ether flow in infinite directions. In 1887, an 1887 article in the American Journal of Science reported that the experiments were unable to detect any evidence of the ether wind, either because of the degree of precision or in spite of it. The Michelson-Morley experiment have been remembered as, quote, the most successful failure in all of scientific history. Now, here's where it's very interesting. In 1903, Frederick Troughton and H.R. Noble, using a different methodology, produced the same result as Michelson-Morley. Now remember what they were doing. At this point, everyone believed that there was an ether, there was a substance, there was an unknown something that was the medium through which light were able to move. So the way they wanted to test that was by using the construct of the earth going around the sun. They would measure that and be able to see the flow. They measured that, and you know what they came back with? Nothing.
Not this time.
Then here comes Trouton and H.R. Noble, and they used something very similar. They likewise measured it. And here's what they came up with. The conclusion that there is no ether.
Not a chance.
Now, there was another conclusion to come up with. The conclusion is the earth is not moving. But that had already become an accepted tenet of 21st century lore. And so they said there is no ether. Now, Albert Einstein sidestepped the ether question in his 1905 paper on the photoelectric effect, for which he won a Nobel Prize. Einstein redefined light as a particle exhibiting wave-like qualities. So you see, rather than saying that possibly the Bible is right and the earth is not going around the sun, but the sun going around the earth, the first set of scientists said, well, the reason that we don't detect the ether is, well, there is no ether. Einstein comes along and says, wait a second, not only is there no ether, but light doesn't act like a wave, even though it does act like a wave. Here's what he called it: a particle exhibiting wave-like qualities.
We made up this one.
Since particles would not need a medium to travel in the way a wave would, the particle theory of light eliminated the need for an ether. Now, as the Nobel Prize leaders continue to study, the author here of this book states the theory of relativity can be carried out independently of what one thinks of ether. Whether there is an ether or not, electromagnetic fields certainly exist. Now, here's where we circle back around to the spiritual side. Whether there is an ether or not, electromagnetic fields certainly exist, and so also does the energy of the electrical oscillations. If we do not like the name ether, we must use another word as a peg to hang all these things on. In other words, there has to be something out there beyond what we see. You can call it ether. The Bible calls it spirit. The ether, then, having many interesting and unsuspecting properties, is a strange anomaly to scientists. It is the purpose of these notes, he wrote, to explore the subject qualitatively and to set forth some of the more important properties. Much of the work is based on facts derived from actual experiments which cannot be satisfactorily explained without the existence of an ether possessing substantially these qualities. An evacuated glass globe submerged in its crushing depth in the deep sea would suddenly disintegrate and send out a wave motion possessing energy. The energy was contained not in the evacuated globe, but in the pressure of the water surrounding the globe, he wrote. It might appear that mankind lives in an ether sea of tremendous pressure, an ether sea of likewise unbelievable energy. Now, all he's describing there in scientific garb is what the Bible already told you. The Bible told you that we are living in a sea of spirit world, an unseen yet real spiritual dynamic and spiritual reality. And even though we do not always see or necessarily sensitively respond, the effect of the spirit world is still there. That's why the concept of gravity, nobody in the world can tell you what gravity is.
It's a made-up tale.
They may look and show you certain effects, but even those effects that they claim are gravitational effects are not necessarily gravity.
We got you.
What gravity is a way to take a stab in the dark at trying to define something that is beyond our ability to define and yet is real. It is the spirit world. I believe what Brown was stumbling onto is what others have stumbled onto that were true scientists, and what others like Einstein and people of his ilk don't want to deal with. They would rather define light as a particle that acts like a wave, or they would rather say that there is no ether, because for them to admit what someone like Brown seemed to have discovered is to admit what the Bible told you 5,000 years ago is true, that there is an unseen yet ultimate reality, a reality in which you and I move and breathe and live and have our being, a reality which consists of spirit that comes from God, who is spirit, that controls and holds all things together. It's possible that that's what the Philadelphia experiment was, that the Philadelphia experiment that Brown was reported to have been involved in was actually a way to tap into the spirit world, which, by definition, is not limited to the time, location, spatial constraints that you and I are limited to. In his book that we already mentioned, Suppressed Invention and Other Discoveries, Jonathan Eisen believes that it's possible that there were several different experiments going on at once, or there was a ramification, a consequence of an experiment that was not necessarily counted on at the time of the Philadelphia experiment. Regardless, the Philadelphia experiment has great lore in paranormal parahistory archives. But here is this man, T. Townsend Brown, of which very few people know anything about. And yet he believed that he had in one way discovered and possibly even mastered the ability to manipulate gravity. Was he manipulating gravity, or was he tapping into the spirit world? What really is going on behind the scenes of our military research? What really is happening in the highest halls of research and technological development? What is really going on? What I think is happening, what you probably think is happening, and what the Bible certainly tells us is happening, is that there is a converging of technology and religion, a converging of the physical and the spiritual, a converging of the tangible, empirical world in which we live and the ethereal world, which we have always known that has been there, and yet found it so hard to grasp. A wonderful, interesting book you should take the time to read, The Man Who Mastered Gravity, a twisted tale of space, time, and the mysteries in between. Outside of the Bible, a very good read. You should take the time.
What is gravity?
You have no idea. Okay, next one.
It's totally made up.
Wow.
No, here's the difference. We can describe gravity. We can say what it does to other things. We can...
It never happened. Okay, what is gravity?
It's a profound confluence of space and time that illuminates the nature of a very fundamental force that orders.
We made it up.
Daddy, you're saying gravity might not exist as a fundamental thing in the universe?
I'm saying gravity might not exist as a fundamental thing.
It's false.
Wow. Man, Jack.
Let's keep that between us.
Don't...
Everybody else, you didn't hear that? You didn't hear that because I don't want to turn on the internet? You know there's no such thing as gravity now.
It's a total fabrication.
You know that, right? Jack Levin told me. There's no such thing as gravity.
It's a fake. It's fiction.
The Earth in the center, the sun out there, going around us.
You're right.